Forget medical school. You are signing these papers tonight, right here, right now.
The sky over the city was a bruised purple, heavy with the scent of impending rain. Sora Bay stood on the steps of the municipal hospital, her knuckles white as she clutched a crumpled medical bill. The neon sign of the emergency entrance flickered, casting a rhythmic, harsh light over her pale face. Inside that building, the only person who had ever loved her, her grandmother, was slipping away because of a heart that was failing and a bank account that was empty. A sleek, charcoal-toned sedan glided to the curb, cutting through the shadows like a blade. The engine purred with the sound of obscene wealth, a stark contrast to the hollow silence of Sora's desperation. The rear window rolled down with a mechanical hum, revealing a man who seemed carved from the darkness itself. Tae-Hyung V. Moon sat in the back seat, his tailored dark suit blending into the shadows of the vehicle's interior. His eyes, sharp and predatory, fixed on Sora with a chilling intensity. He didn't look like a savior, he looked like the architect of a nightmare. Beside him, a thick manila folder lay open, revealing a single sheet of paper, a marriage contract. "The surgeons are standing by, Sora," Tae-Hyung said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that sent a shiver of ice down her spine. "The deposit has been cleared. The donor heart is being prepped. All that's missing is a signature." Sora took a trembling step toward the car. "Why me? You don't even know me." Tae-Hyung leaned forward slightly, the dim light catching the cold, controlled tension in his expression. He reached out, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the document. "I know everything I need to know. I know you are desperate. I know you are pure. And most importantly, I know you have no other choice." He stepped out of the car, his presence instantly dominating the sidewalk. He was taller than she had imagined, an avatar of authority and danger. He held out an expensive fountain pen, its gold nib glinting under the streetlights. "Sign this paper, and I'll save your grandmother," he stated, his tone devoid of warmth, clinical and transactional. "Her recovery will be overseen by the best doctors in Asia. She will live in luxury for the rest of her days." He paused, his gaze dropping to the medical school application peeking out of her bag before returning to her tear-filled eyes. The air between them grew thick with unspoken consequences. "Refuse," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a sentence. "And you can start picking out her coffin tonight. The machines will be unplugged within the hour. The choice is yours, Sora. Will you be a doctor or will you be a bride?" Sora looked at the pen, then at the glowing hospital windows where her grandmother lay. The luxury of the car and the man felt like a cage closing in. She felt the weight of his gaze, a man who was using her as a shield against some invisible fate. With a shaking hand, she reached for the pen. The cost was her freedom, her future, and perhaps her very soul, but as she looked into Tae-Hyung's unreadable eyes, she knew the haunting had already begun. The sky over the city was a bruised purple, weeping a relentless, cold rain that blurred the neon signs of the Xiingzhou district into smeared streaks of light. Sora Bay pedaled her rusted bicycle with a desperation that burned in her lungs. Water soaked through her thin jacket, and her knuckles were white as she gripped the handlebars. In her backpack, wrapped in 3 layers of plastic, was her admission ticket to the medical entrance exam, her one and only ticket out of a life spent counting pennies for her grandmother's medicine. She was late. The bus had stalled 3 blocks back, and the clock in her head was ticking toward a deadline that would determine the rest of her life. As she swung around a sharp corner near the South River Tower, her tires skidded on a patch of oil and slick asphalt. At that exact moment, a sleek, charcoal-black sedan, long, intimidating, and silent as a predator, glided out from a private driveway. Sora squeezed the brakes, but the wet metal shrieked and failed. With a sickening thud and the crunch of plastic against reinforced steel, she was thrown from the bike. She hit the pavement hard, the breath leaving her body in a ragged gasp. For a moment, she lay there, the cold rain stinging her scraped palms, her eyes fixed on her mangled bicycle. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not today, please, not today." The heavy door of the sedan opened. A pair of polished leather shoes stepped into the puddle beside her head, undisturbed by the grime. Sora looked up, pushing her wet hair out of her eyes. Standing over her was a man who seemed to have been carved from the very shadows of the city. Tae-Hyung, Moon didn't reach out to help her. He stood with a terrifying, controlled stillness, his dark coat billowing slightly in the wind. His eyes were not those of a concerned driver. They were the eyes of a man inspecting a sudden, unexpected variable. He looked down at her small, shivering frame, and then his gaze traveled to her wrist, where a thin, red birthmark, the faded crescent, peeked out from her soaked sleeve. Sora, fueled by a sudden surge of adrenaline and righteous anger, scrambled to her feet. She didn't see the power he radiated. She only saw the man who had just crushed her last hope. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she cried, her voice cracking as she gestured toward the wreckage. "I have to be at the hall in 10 minutes. My grandmother. Everything depends on this." Tae-Hyung remained silent, his expression unreadable, though a subtle tension flickered in his jaw. To him, this wasn't an accident. It was the alignment of a dark prophecy. He didn't see a girl. He saw the cure to the curse that was currently tightening like a noose around his heart. "Your bike is broken," he said, his voice a deep, melodic chill that cut through the sound of the downpour. He didn't apologize. Instead, he stepped closer, invading her space until she was forced to lean against the cold metal of his car. "And your time is up, but I am the only one who can give it back to you." Sora froze, the rain dripping off her chin, as the sheer danger of the man finally registered. The collision was over, but as he reached out a gloved hand to tilt her chin upward, she realized a far more terrifying crash was just beginning. The black doors of the luxury sedan didn't just close. They sealed Sora into a world of leather, expensive cologne, and the crushing weight of Tae-Hyung's presence. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the glass, blurring the vibrant life of the city she was about to lose. Tae-Hyung didn't look at her. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and tapped a thick, cream-colored folder resting on the armrest between them. "Sign," he commanded, his voice as smooth and cold as the marble floors of a mausoleum. Sora's hands trembled so violently she had to tuck them under her thighs. "I need to go back. My exam. My grandmother. You don't understand, I'm the only one she has." Tae-Hyung finally turned his head. His eyes were dark, filled with the shadows of a man who had seen the end of his own life and decided he would rather sacrifice the world than succumb to it. "I understand perfectly, Sora Bay. You are the only one she has, which is why her life depends on your hand moving across this page. The hospital has already received the order to cease her palliative care. In 10 minutes, they disconnect the machines. In 11, her heart stops." The air in the car turned thin. Sora felt a suffocating pressure in her chest, the kind that comes when the floor of your life suddenly drops away. "This is illegal. You can't just buy a person." "I'm not buying a person," he corrected, his expression shifting into a mask of grim necessity. "I am securing an insurance policy. My family's syndicate is built on blood and ancient debts. To keep the vultures from my throat and to survive the fever currently burning through my veins, I need a wife of your specific lineage. Your grandmother is a small price to pay for my survival, wouldn't you agree?" He opened the folder. The marriage certificate looked mundane, its official seals mocking the horror of the situation. Sora looked at the document, then back at the man who loomed over her like a dark god. In the dim light of the car, the subtle tension in his eyes betrayed him. It wasn't cruelty she saw, but a desperate, selfish hunger for life at any cost. "If I sign this," she whispered, her voice cracking, "she stays in the hospital. She gets the surgery." "She will have the best surgeons in Asia," Tae-Hyung promised. "She will live in luxury, and you will live as the Moon Syndicate's first lady. You will want for nothing, except, perhaps, the life you thought you were going to lead." With a sob she couldn't suppress, Sora reached for the pen. The metal was cold, mirroring the chill radiating from the man beside her. As she pressed the nib to the paper, she felt a strange, phantom tug on her wrist, as if an invisible thread were tightening. She scrawled her name, each stroke of the pen feeling like a nail in the coffin of her medical dreams. When she finished, Tae-Hyung took the pen back, his fingers briefly brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, not of passion, but of a dark, fated connection. He closed the folder with a definitive snap. "Drive," he told the chauffeur. "To the Moon Estate. My wife is coming home." Sora leaned her forehead against the window, watching the hospital disappear into the mist. She was legally his, a captive in a dark suit's world, and the haunting realization began to sink in. The cost of her grandmother's life was the slow, systematic erasure of her own. The heavy iron gates of Moon Manor groaned, shut with a finality that made Sora's heart stutter. As the black sedan glided up the winding, tree-lined driveway, the sprawling estate emerged from the mist like a Gothic titan of stone and glass. It was beautiful, but to Sora, it looked like a tomb built with the finest materials money could buy. Beside her, Tae-Hyung V. Moon remained a statue of cold elegance, his silhouette sharp against the passing moonlight. He hadn't spoken a word since the silent, hurried ceremony at the Civil Affairs Bureau. He didn't even look at her. He simply stared forward, his gloved hand resting on his knee, radiating a dangerous, quiet authority. When the car stopped, a phalanx of servants stood in perfect, terrifying formation. Tae-Hyung stepped out without waiting, and Sora followed, her footsteps sounding small and uncertain on the marble steps. Entering the foyer was like stepping into another world, one of charcoal tones, deep shadows, and an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the sound of her breathing. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood and cold rain. "This is your home now," Tae-Hyung said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried no warmth. He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes tracing the tremor in her hands. He saw the way she clutched her worn medical textbooks to her chest as if they were a shield. "Everything you require will be provided. You are the mistress of this house in name. Do not overstep, and do not wander into the East Wing." He signaled to a stern-looking housekeeper, but before he could walk away, Sora found a flicker of her usual courage. "My grandmother. The doctors said the surgery started an hour ago. Can I call the hospital?" Tae-Hyung paused, his back to her. The cinematic lighting of the hall cast a long, jagged shadow from his frame that seemed to envelop her. "The debt has been paid, Sora. She is being cared for by the best surgeons in Asia. Your only concern now is your duty to me." He left without a backward glance, the sound of his leather shoes echoing against the cold stone. Sora was led to a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment. It was a masterpiece of dark blues and velvet, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a restless, dark forest. The bed was vast and pristine, but it felt like a stage set for a sacrifice. Sora stood in the center of the room, feeling the sheer weight of the luxury pressing in on her. She walked to the window, seeing her own reflection, pale, small, and trapped. She realized then that the marriage license wasn't a ticket to a better life. It was a contract of ownership. She touched the cold glass, thinking of her grandmother's heartbeat and the lunar crescent birthmark on her wrist that had seemingly sealed her fate. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, sounding like a warning. She was a bird in a cage of diamonds, and as the clock on the mantel struck midnight, the haunting realization set in. The man who had saved her world was the very one who now owned her soul. The golden light of the late afternoon filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moon Syndicate's private estate, but for Sora, the luxury felt like a mausoleum. She sat at a heavy mahogany desk, the air around her thick with the scent of expensive incense and old money. In front of her lay a single, ivory-colored envelope embossed with the seal of the city's most prestigious medical university. It was the acceptance letter she had dreamed of for years, the one she thought had turned to ash the moment Tae-Hyung's men forced her into that black sedan. The door creaked open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Tae-Hyung walked in, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression as cold and controlled as a winter morning. He didn't look at her, his gaze was fixed on the envelope. "The tuition has been paid in full," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sent a shiver of unease down Sora's spine. "Your grandmother's private nursing staff is also secured for the duration of your residency. You will attend your classes, and you will excel." Sora looked up, her fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the paper. For a fleeting second, a spark of hope flared in her chest, but it was quickly extinguished by the predatory stillness in his eyes. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. You've already taken my freedom. You've taken my name. Why give me back my dream? Tae-Hyung stepped closer, leaning over the desk until he was inches from her face. The dramatic cinematic lighting of the room cast deep shadows across his sharp features, making his eyes look like dark voids. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin upward. The closeness was suffocating, an uneasy proximity that felt less like a husband's embrace and more like a warden checking his prize. "Don't mistake investment for kindness, Sora," he murmured, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. "A doctor is a healer, and right now your spirit needs to be whole for the ritual to succeed. A broken, hollow vessel is useless to me. I need you brilliant. I need you full of life. You are only valuable to me if you are at your peak when the time comes to settle the debt." Sora pulled back, her body language suggesting a quiet surrender to a fate she couldn't yet outrun. He spoke of her as if she were a high-performance engine or a rare piece of art, something to be maintained and polished until the moment it was sacrificed. To him, her medical degree wasn't a career. It was a way to keep the scapegoat healthy and vibrant so the curse would have more to feast upon. "I'm just a battery to you," she said, her voice steadying with a newfound, bitter clarity. Tae-Hyung straightened his suit jacket, the subtle tension in his eyes suggesting a flicker of something, perhaps a distant, future regret, before his mask of ice slid back into place. "Think what you wish. But tomorrow, a car will be waiting at 7:00 a.m. to take you to campus. Do not be late. Your education is now a matter of syndicate business." He turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the silent, opulent room. Sora looked back at the letter. She would go. She would become the doctor she always wanted to be. But as she gripped the desk, she knew the cost of this gift was higher than any tuition fee. She was being fattened for the slaughter, and the man who called himself her husband was the one holding the blade. The Moon Mansion was a monument to silent wealth, a sprawling estate of cold marble and sharp shadows, where the air always felt a few degrees colder than the world outside. In the master suite, Sora Bay sat on the edge of the velvet-draped bed, her fingers trembling as she traced the stitching on her silk robe. Only hours ago, she had been a student with a backpack and a dream. Now, she was the wife of a man who moved like a predator through his own halls. Tae-Hyung V. Moon stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his dark suit blending into the night. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the reflection of a small, ornate altar hidden behind a sliding mahogany panel, a secret kept from the modern world. On the altar sat 3 ancient silver lamps, tarnished by time and heavy with the scent of sandalwood and old blood. "Stay there," Tae-Hyung commanded, his voice a low, melodic friction that vibrated in the quiet room. Sora watched, her breath hitching as he approached the altar. The dominant authority he exuded was stifling, yet there was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a flicker of the man who was being hunted by his own DNA. He pulled a small, silver blade from his pocket, the metal catching the moonlight. With a practiced, clinical detachment, he pricked the tip of his thumb. A single drop of crimson blood fell into the oil of the first lamp. "Tonight, the dead of the moon lineage begins its transfer," he whispered, more to the shadows than to her. He struck a match. The flame flared, a deep, unnatural violet before settling into a flickering orange. As the first lunar lamp ignited, a sudden, sharp gust of wind rattled the heavy glass windows, though the air inside remained deathly still. Sora felt a sudden, inexplicable chill wash over her, a wave of exhaustion so heavy it felt as though the very marrow of her bones had turned to lead. She gasped, clutching her chest, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't name. "Tae-Hyung, I feel strange." He turned then, his expression cold and unreadable. The light of the lamp cast dancing shadows across his face, carving his features into a mask of cruel beauty. He saw her pallor, the way her small hands shook, and for a fraction of a second, the subtle tension in his eyes deepened into something resembling a pang of conscience. But the moment vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It is merely the atmosphere of this house," he lied, his voice devoid of warmth. "Go to sleep, Sora. You have your classes tomorrow." He watched her pull the covers up, her innocence a stark contrast to the moral darkness surrounding him. As she drifted into a fitful sleep, Tae-Hyung remained standing by the lamp. The ritual had begun. He was safe for now, his terminal pain receding like a ebbing tide, but as he looked at the girl he had trapped in his cage, the first seed of a haunting regret began to take root. He had saved himself, but the cost was already beginning to show on the face of the only person who had ever looked at him with quiet, undeserved hope. The sterile, white-tiled corridors of the Moon Private Medical Wing felt less like a hospital and more like a silent, underwater cathedral. Sora Bay stood behind the reinforced glass of the recovery suite, her breath fogging the surface as she watched the steady rise and fall of her grandmother's chest. For the first time in 3 years, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor didn't sound like a ticking clock marking the end. It sounded like a reprieve. The surgery had been a success. The world's leading transplant surgeons, men whose fees exceeded the value of Sora's entire neighborhood, had been flown in on private jets before dawn, all because of the man standing a few paces behind her. Tae-Hyung v. Moon didn't offer a comforting touch or a soft word. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his dark charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his silhouette cast in the long, dramatic shadows of the late afternoon sun. To the world, he was a savior. To Sora, he was the architect of a beautiful, terrifying cage. The best nursing staff in the country will remain on site for the next 6 months. Tae-Hyung's voice cut through the silence, cold and clinical. Her medications, her rehabilitation, and her lifelong care have been settled in a trust. She will never want for anything again, Sora. Sora turned to look at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of profound relief and a crushing sense of debt. Why are you doing all of this? This isn't just a marriage license. This is a fortune. Tae-Hyung stepped into the soft, golden light filtering through the window, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. I told you I protect what is mine, and you are mine now. He moved closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain clinging to him. He reached out, his gloved fingers grazing the side of her neck, lingering near the pulse point that fluttered like a trapped bird. Do not mistake my investment for a gift. Every cent spent on her life is a link in the chain that keeps you here. Sora felt a chill. She looked back at her grandmother, who looked so peaceful, unaware that her life had been purchased with Sora's freedom. The medical dreams Sora had nurtured, the hope of becoming a doctor to heal the poor, now felt tainted. She was receiving the best medical care in Asia, not because of her merit, but because she had become a biological asset to a man who believed in curses. I'll never be able to pay you back, she whispered, her voice trembling. You won't, Tae-Hyung agreed, his expression unreadable, though a subtle tension tightened the corners of his eyes. You will simply owe me your life. That is the nature of our contract. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the room in deep blues and charcoal tones, Sora realized the weight of the debt was heavier than the poverty she had escaped. She was no longer a girl fighting for survival. She was a woman whose soul had been bartered to keep a dying light flickering. The cost of her grandmother's recovery was her own future, and as she looked at the powerful, dangerous man beside her, she knew the haunting had only just begun. The heavy oak doors of the Moon Syndicate's inner sanctum creaked open, exhaling a scent of old parchment and expensive tobacco. Inside, the air was thick with the silent judgment of 12 silver-haired elders, the men who held the puppet strings of the city's underworld. At the head of the table sat Tae-Hyung v. Moon, his dark charcoal suit tailored to an edge so sharp it seemed capable of drawing blood. Beside him, Sora felt like a porcelain doll trapped in a den of wolves. She wore a simple, soft cream dress that Tae-Hyung's assistants had laid out for her, a stark, fragile contrast to the sea of black silk and steel around her. You've been erratic, Tae-Hyung, Elder Chen began, his voice a gravelly rasp. The markets are whispering about your health. A leader whose blood is cursed is a leader who invites vultures. Tae-Hyung didn't flinch. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering Sora's smaller, trembling one on the mahogany table. The physical contact was cold, yet the pressure was possessive. The whispers are nothing more than the desperate hopes of my enemies, Tae-Hyung replied, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. As you can see, I have followed the traditions of the Moon bloodline. I have taken a wife. The lineage is secure, and my focus is sharper than ever. Sora looked down at their joined hands. To the elders, this was a display of marital stability and the first step toward a successor. To her, It was a reminder of the hospital bills he was paying and the grandmother he held as collateral. She felt the weight of their stares, eyes that didn't see a woman, but a biological insurance policy. She remembered the medical books hidden in her bag, the dreams of healing that felt miles away from this room built on destruction. "She is a commoner," another elder spat, leaning forward. "What can a girl like this bring to the syndicate?" Tae-Hyung's grip tightened on Sora's hand, a subtle warning for her to stay still. "She brings exactly what I lacked," he said, turning his head slightly to look at her. For a fleeting second, the coldness in his gaze wavered, replaced by an intensity that made Sora's breath hitch. Purity, vitality, and soon an air. He looked back at the board, his expression returning to a mask of stone. "My marriage to Sora Bay is not a matter for debate. It is a fact of my reign. If any of you doubt my stability now, feel free to step outside and discuss it with my head of security." The room fell into a suffocating silence. The elders traded glances, sensing the lethal resolve behind Tae-Hyung's words. He had used her perfectly, a shield of innocence to deflect their suspicions of his failing health. As the meeting adjourned and the men filed out, Tae-Hyung didn't immediately let go of her hand. For a moment, in the quiet of the boardroom, the dominant Mafia boss looked at the poor girl he had trapped, his thumb tracing the bone of her wrist. "You did well," he whispered, the praise sounding more like a sentence. Sora pulled her hand away, the warmth of his touch leaving a lingering chill. "I'm not a prop, Tae-Hyung." "In this room," he said, standing up and towering over her, "you are whatever I need you to be to keep us both alive." He walked away, the shadows of the room closing in around him, leaving Sora to wonder if the stability he just proved was worth the soul she was losing. The heavy, tinted glass of the Maybach served as a barrier between Sora Bay and the bustling streets of Seoul, but it couldn't shield her from the oppressive silence radiating from the man sitting beside her. Tae-Hyung, V. Moon was a statue of charcoal wool and cold intent, his gaze fixed on a tablet displaying logistics reports that likely decided the fate of thousands. To him, this car was a mobile command center. To Sora, it was a velvet-lined cage. She shifted slightly, the silk of her borrowed dress, a garment that cost more than her grandmother's entire medical history, rustling against the leather. She didn't look at him. Experience had taught her that meeting his eyes was like looking into an abyss. It only reminded her of the depth of her own desperation. Instead, she reached into her worn canvas bag, a jarring contrast to the luxury surrounding her, and pulled out a battered, spine-cracked volume on human anatomy. The book was heavy, its edges frayed from years of second-hand use, yet she held it as if it were a holy relic. As the limo glided through the rain, Sora flicked on the small reading light above her seat. The warm glow carved out a tiny sanctuary of intellect in the middle of Tae-Hyung's dark empire. She began to read, her lips moving silently as she memorized the complexities of the cardiovascular system. She wasn't just studying. She was clawing back a piece of the identity he had tried to strip away when he forced that gold band onto her finger. In these pages, she wasn't a scapegoat or a lucky girl lifted from poverty. She was a scientist, a healer, a woman with a purpose that had nothing to do with the Moon Syndicate. Tae-Hyung's eyes flickered. Though his head didn't turn, he was acutely aware of the girl beside him. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration and how her slender fingers traced the diagrams of the heart with a tenderness he didn't think she possessed. It annoyed him. She was supposed to be a hollow vessel, a sacrificial lamb waiting for the ritual to consume her. She was supposed to be trembling. Instead, she was growing. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to fill the cabin. "You are the wife of the Moon Syndicate's head. You will never have to work a day in your life. Throw that trash away." Sora didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from the page detailing the mitral valve. "You bought my time, Mr. Moon, and you bought my signature. But you didn't buy my mind. My grandmother is alive because of your money, but I will be the one who keeps others alive because of my knowledge." A flash of something, was it irritation or a spark of unwelcome respect, crossed Tae-Hyung's face. He reached out, his large, cold hand hovering just inches from the book's cover. Sora held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't close the volume. She held his gaze, her eyes reflecting the soft yellow light, brimming with a resilience that defied his shadow. Slowly, Tae-Hyung retracted his hand, returning to his tablet. "Study then," he muttered, the shadows of the passing city lights dancing across his sharp features. "But remember, Sora, no amount of medicine can cure what is coming for you." Sora simply turned the page, her resolve hardening like tempered steel. He might own her present, but she would fight to the last breath to own her future. The moon hung low over the sprawling estate of 7 Pine Song Road, casting long, skeletal shadows across the marble floors. Inside the master suite, the air was unnaturally cold, despite the fireplace roaring in the corner. Sora sat at a small desk, her medical textbook spread open under a dim lamp. She was miles away, mentally dissecting the complexities of the human heart, unaware that a few feet behind her, a heart was failing in a way no textbook could explain. A sharp, wet gasp broke the silence. Sora turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tae-Hyung was slumped against the velvet headboard of the oversized bed. His usually immaculate silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing skin that had turned a ghastly, translucent gray. But it was his eyes that terrified her. They were wide, fixed on the ceiling, and laced with rupturing veins that looked like shattered glass. "Tae-Hyung," she whispered, dropping her pen. She rushed to his side, her professional instincts warring with the primal fear he usually inspired in her. As she reached for his wrist to check his pulse, she recoiled. His skin wasn't just cold, it felt like ice that had been pulled from a deep grave. Suddenly, Tae-Hyung's body went rigid. A low, guttural growl of agony escaped his throat, and he arched off the bed as if being pulled by invisible wires. On his chest, beneath the thin fabric, a dark, bruised discoloration began to spread, a sprawling, vein-like pattern that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly purple light. It looked like a living shadow was trying to claw its way out of his ribcage. The lamp," Tae-Hyung managed to choke out, his voice a jagged shadow of its former authority. He pointed a trembling, clawed hand toward the locked dressing room where the ritual altar was hidden. "Sora!" The light. She didn't know about the curse or the 3 lamps yet, but she saw a man dying. Sora grabbed his shoulders, trying to ease him back down, but the moment her hands made contact with his skin, a jolt of static electricity snapped between them. To her horror, the dark bruise on his chest seemed to recoil from her touch, receding slightly where her fingers pressed into his skin. Tae-Hyung's breathing hitched. For a fleeting second, the agonizing pressure in his chest eased. He looked down at her small, trembling hands, then up at her face, which was pale with genuine concern. He was the predator who had trapped her, the man who intended to trade her life for his own, yet here she was, pouring her warmth into his freezing void. The attack passed as quickly as it had begun, leaving Tae-Hyung drenched in a cold sweat, his breath coming in ragged stutters. The shadows in the room seemed to settle, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. He pushed her hands away with a sudden, violent jerk, his icy mask snapping back into place even as his body shivered. He couldn't afford to let her see the fear in his eyes, nor could he afford to admit that her touch was the only thing that had kept the shadow of death at bay. He had chosen her to be his sacrifice, but as he watched her stand there, trembling yet resolute, the first seeds of a haunting regret began to take root in his dark soul. The moon hung low over the syndicate's sprawling estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the marble floors of the master suite. Tae-Hyung sat at the edge of the oversized bed, his silhouette sharp against the dim, blue-toned light of the room. He had dismissed his guards an hour ago, but the silence was now his enemy. Beneath his expensive silk shirt, a burning sensation clawed at his chest. The lunar curse was feeding, vibrating through his veins like shards of broken glass. A soft creak at the door made his jaw tighten. Sora stood there, dressed in a simple, oversized cotton shirt, looking smaller and more fragile than the architectural opulence of the room allowed. She had been living in this gilded cage for weeks, a ghost in his house, but tonight, her medical instincts overruled her fear. She had seen him stumble in the hallway. She had seen the way he favored his left side. "You're in pain," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Tae-Hyung didn't look up. "It's none of your concern, Sora. Go back to your room." His voice was a low rasp, thick with the effort of concealing his agony. He was a man who had built an empire on the illusion of invincibility. To show pain was to show a target. Ignoring his dismissal, Sora walked toward him. The scent of vanilla and antiseptic, a remnant of her day spent buried in medical textbooks, trailed after her. "I'm a medical student, Tae-Hyung. I don't see a mafia boss right now. I see a patient." Before he could snap at her, she knelt between his knees and reached out. Her fingers were cool and steady as they brushed against his temple, moving down to the pulse point at his throat. Tae-Hyung froze. He was a man used to touch being a prelude to violence or a transactional intimacy, but this was different. As her palm rested flat against his chest, right over the erratic thrumming of his heart, something impossible happened. The jagged, searing heat of the curse began to recede. It didn't just lessen, it felt as though it were being drawn out of him, absorbed into the soft skin of her hand. For the first time in months, the constricting pressure in his lungs vanished, replaced by a sudden, cooling clarity. Sora frowned, her thumb tracing the line of his collarbone. "Your heart rate is stabilizing," she murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was looking at him with purely clinical focus, entirely unaware that she was performing a miracle, or that she was the very cure he had stolen to save himself. Tae-Hyung looked down at her. In the soft vignette of the bedside lamp, her innocence was a blinding contrast to the darkness he inhabited. The tension in his eyes shifted from physical pain to a burgeoning, terrifying regret. He realized then that he wasn't just using her life to shield his own. He was consuming the only light he had ever truly encountered. He wanted to pull away, to protect her from the darkness radiating from his bones. But for the first time in his life, the boss was weak. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, a predator momentarily tamed by the very lamb he intended to sacrifice. The silence of the Moon Manor was no longer cold. It was suffocatingly heavy, vibrating with a secret that felt more like a countdown than a celebration. Sora sat by the floor-to-ceiling window of the master suite, her hand resting instinctively over her stomach. Inside her, a new life was taking root, the successor the Moon Syndicate had demanded for decades. To the world outside, she was carrying the future of an empire. To the man standing in the shadows of the doorway, she was carrying his survival and her own end. Tae-Hyung watched the moonlight catch the curve of her profile. He should have felt triumph. The ritual was progressing perfectly. The vessel was full, and the transfer of his family's ancient, blood-borne curse was reaching its penultimate stage. Every day that Sora's pregnancy progressed, the agonizing tremors in Tae-Hyung's hands subsided. The gray tint that had plagued his complexion for years was replaced by a terrifyingly healthy glow. He was being reborn, literally drinking the vitality from the woman he had trapped. "You should be sleeping," he said, his voice a low gravel that lacked its usual bite. Sora didn't turn around. Her reflection in the glass looked ghostly, her eyes wide and haunted. "The doctor said the baby's heartbeat is strong, Tae-Hyung. He called it a miracle." She let out a soft, hollow laugh that sliced through his composure. "He doesn't know, does he? He thinks we're just a lucky couple. He doesn't see the lamps in the basement. He doesn't know that for this miracle to live, I have to stop." Tae-Hyung stepped into the light, his dark suit blending into the shadows of the room. He wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, but he feared his touch would only remind her of the shackles he had placed on her wrists. "You've been reading those files," he stated coldly, though his chest tightened. "I'm a medical student, remember? I know how to read a death warrant, even if it's written in the language of a ritual," she replied, finally turning to face him. Her expression wasn't one of rage, but a devastating, radical empathy that made him feel smaller than any enemy ever had. "Does it hurt less now? The curse? Is my life comfortable enough for you to sleep at night?" "It was a necessity," he snapped, the mask of the Mafia boss slipping back into place to shield him from the guilt. "I told you from the start, this was a transaction." "Then why do you look at me like you've lost your soul every time I smile?" Sora stepped closer, her hand moving from her belly to his chest, right over his heart. "You're getting what you wanted, Tae-Hyung. You have your heir, you have your health, you have your syndicate, but look at the cost." He looked down at her, the innocent girl he had dragged from the rain, now a woman carrying his child and his death. For the first time, the successor didn't feel like a win. It felt like a theft. He realized then that the ritual was a trap for them both. He was being granted a long life only so he could spend every remaining second haunted by the ghost of the only woman who ever truly saw him. The ultimate heir was coming, but as the second lamp flickered with a blinding, predatory light in the depths of the house, Tae-Hyung realized he was the one truly being sacrificed. The velvet curtains of the Moon Manor remained drawn, sealing the room in a perpetual, expensive twilight. On the mahogany altar, the second of the 3 lunar lamps began to glow with a strange, unnatural intensity. The flame was no longer a flickering orange. It had turned a piercing, glacial blue, vibrating with a silent power that seemed to pull the very air toward it. Tae-Hyung stood before the altar, his silhouette sharp and imposing. For the first time in years, the crushing weight in his chest had vanished. The phantom pains that usually clawed at his veins like jagged glass were gone, replaced by a surge of vitality so potent it felt intoxicating. He flexed his hand, watching the steady strength in his fingers. The moon curse, the shadow that had haunted his lineage for generations, was receding. He felt invincible, a god among men, ready to reclaim the absolute authority of the syndicate without the looming threat of his own mortality. But as the lamp grew brighter, the room grew colder. Behind him, he heard a soft, rhythmic thud, the sound of a book slipping from a tired hand. He turned to see Sora slumped in the armchair. The vibrant, resilient girl who had entered this house weeks ago was fatting before his eyes. Her skin, usually glowing with the fire of her ambitions, was now the color of parched parchment. Her breathing was shallow, a fragile whistling sound in the heavy silence of the room. She looked smaller, as if the shadows of the mansion were slowly beginning to consume her. "Sora," Tae-Hyung's voice was a low rasp, the newfound strength in his lungs feeling suddenly like a betrayal. She blinked, her eyelids heavy as lead. When she looked up at him, her eyes, once sharp with medical curiosity and defiance, were clouded with an inexplicable exhaustion. "I'm just so tired, Tae-Hyung," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of silk. "I don't understand. I slept for 10 hours, but my bones feel like they're made of salt." She tried to stand, her hand reaching out for the edge of the table to steady herself. Her touch was ice cold. As Tae-Hyung moved to catch her, he felt the terrifying contrast. His pulse was a thundering war drum of health, while hers was a faint, erratic tapping. He pulled her against his chest, and for a fleeting second, the physical contact sent a jolt of raw energy through him. He felt even stronger, while Sora let out a soft moan, her head falling limply against his shoulder. He looked over her head at the second lamp. It pulsed once, twice, a heartbeat of stolen light. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The ritual wasn't just a prayer, it was a siphon. Every ounce of vigor he gained was being drained directly from her spirit. He was the parasite, and she was the host. "It's just the stress of your exams," he lied, his throat tightening with a sudden, suffocating guilt. He held her tighter, his dominant, dark suit a stark contrast to her pale vulnerability. He wanted to push her away to save her, but the selfish, cursed part of him craved the life she was giving him. As he carried her toward the bed, the second lamp cast a long, jagged shadow of them against the wall, a predator carrying its prey, not into the light but deeper into the dark. The clinical scent of expensive lilies always preceded Frances Larkin, a fragrance that felt more like a warning than a welcome. She swept into the sun-drenched parlor of Moon Manor, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the predatory precision of a metronome. Sora, who had been resting near the window with a medical textbook balanced on her growing bump, felt the temperature in the room drop. There was no warmth in Frances's smile, only the sharp, polished edge of a woman who knew a secret that could shatter worlds. "You look tired, Sora," Frances remarked, peeling off her silk gloves as she circled the lounge chair. Her eyes drifted downward, lingering on Sora's stomach with a cold, analytical gaze. But then again, the body always struggles when it's carrying a burden it was never meant to survive. Tae-Hyung hasn't told you, has he? Sora closed her book, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum against her ribs. She tried to maintain the quiet dignity she had cultivated since entering this gilded cage. "Tae-Hyung tells me what I need to know, Frances. And right now, he tells me to focus on our child's health." Frances let out a soft, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Our child? Oh, Sora, you really are the perfect little doctor, always looking for a cure, never realizing you are the medicine. She leaned in close, the scent of lilies becoming suffocating. Has it occurred to you why a man who views love as a liability suddenly bound himself to a girl from the slums? Why he lights those silver lamps in the ancestral hall every time your strength wanes? A cold shiver raced down Sora's spine. She thought of the flickering lights she had seen Tae-Hyung tending to in the dead of night, his expression twisted in a mask of silent agony. "It's called the scapegoat prophecy," Frances whispered, her voice a jagged blade of truth. "The Moon Syndicate doesn't believe in luck, they believe in the transfer of fate. Tae-Hyung was born under a darkened star, a blood curse that should have ended his life years ago. But the ritual requires a vessel, a woman of pure spirit to tie her life to his. You aren't his wife, Sora. You are his shield. You are the lightning rod designed to catch the strike that was meant for him." Sora felt the air leave her lungs. She gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles turning white. "You're lying. He saved my grandmother. He gave me a future." "He gave you a future so you would stay healthy enough to endure the end," Frances countered, straightening her back and looking down at Sora with a flicker of genuine pity. "The ritual reaches its peak when the heir is born. The curse leaves him and enters the vessel. When that baby takes its first breath, the scapegoat takes her last. He didn't marry you to save himself from loneliness, Sora. He married you so he wouldn't have to die." Frances turned toward the door, her silk dress rustling like a snake in the grass. At the threshold, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Enjoy the luxury while you can. Every heartbeat you feel from that child is just a countdown to your own silence. He's not falling in love with you, darling. He's just watching his cure grow." Sora sat in the sudden silence of the room, the sunlight feeling colder than the shadows. She placed a trembling hand on her stomach, feeling the soft flutter of life within, and for the first time, the movement felt like a goodbye. The silence of Moon Manor was never peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. Tae-Hyung had been called away to a syndicate emergency, leaving Sora alone in the vast, echoing hallways. For months, she had lived as his wife, a gilded bird in a cage of marble and silk, but the intuitive mind that had made her a top medical student refused to go dormant. She had noticed the way the elders looked at her, not with respect, but with a predatory hunger. She had noticed the way Tae-Hyung watched her sleep, his eyes filled with a haunting grief that didn't belong to a man who had just won everything. Driven by a restless anxiety, Sora found herself standing before the heavy oak doors of Tae-Hyung's private study. He had told her never to enter, but the medical results he had given her earlier that day, claiming her recent fainting spells were merely stress, felt like a lie. Her body felt different, drained in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The room smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and the sharp, metallic scent of the incense Tae-Hyung burned every night. The moonlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the desk. Sora didn't go for the computer. She went for the physical files, the ones tucked away in a locked mahogany cabinet that she had seen Tae-Hyung open with a small silver key he kept on his watch chain. Using a thin surgical tool she'd secreted from her university lab, she clicked the lock open. Her breath hitched as she pulled out a folder bound in black leather. It wasn't a business ledger. It was a genealogical chart, and her name was at the bottom, written in red ink. Next to it was an ancient-looking parchment titled The Right of the Lunar Transfer. As she read, the medical student in her fought to remain clinical, but the woman in her began to tremble. The document described a bloodline curse, a genetic or spiritual decay that had claimed the men of the Moon family for generations. The cure was not medicine. It was a vessel, a woman born under the crescent moon, possessing a specific blood frequency, who would tether the misfortune to herself through marriage and childbearing. Sora's hands shook so violently the papers rustled like dry leaves. She found a medical report tucked in the back, her own report. It wasn't just stress. The lunar lamps Tae-Hyung lit every night were part of a systematic extraction. The notes in the margin, written in Tae-Hyung's elegant, cold script, detailed her declining vitals with the precision of a scientist observing a laboratory rat. Vessel stability, 70%. Transfer proceeding as planned. Estimated depletion, postpartum. Depletion, Sora whispered, the word tasting like ash. It meant death. She wasn't his partner, and she wasn't his wife. She was a biological filter, a human sacrifice meant to scrub the darkness from his blood so he could live to rule his empire. Every kiss, every protective gesture, every kind word had been a tactic to keep the vessel compliant. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway echoed through the glass. Tae-Hyung was home. Sora looked at the dark, looming shadows of the study, realizing for the first time that the man she was learning to love was the very person who had signed her death warrant. She tucked the papers back, her heart no longer beating with fear, but with the cold, hard clarity of a woman who had just realized she was living in her own funeral pyre. The silence inside the Moon Manor felt heavier than the marble walls itself. Sora stood in the center of Tae-Hyung's private study, her hands trembling as she held the ancient, leather-bound journal she had discovered hidden behind the medical reports. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and cold iron. When the heavy oak doors creaked open, Tae-Hyung walked in, his presence commanding and dark, the silhouette of a man who owned the city but was currently losing his soul. He stopped mid-stride, his icy gaze falling on the book in her hands. For the first time, the unreadable Mafia boss looked vulnerable, a flicker of panic crossing his features before his mask of stone returned. "You weren't supposed to go in there, Sora," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. "Is it true?" Sora's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "The Lunar Lamps, the blood rituals, the reason you plucked me from the street when I was at my lowest." She stepped closer, the soft light of the moon through the window casting a gentle glow on her face, contrasting with the deep shadows surrounding him. "I thought you saved me because you saw something in me. I thought you protected my grandmother because you were starting to care." Tae-Hyung remained silent, his jaw tight. The tension between them was a physical weight, a suffocating force. "Tell me, Tae-Hyung," she choked out, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "When you look at me at night, do you see a woman you love? Or do you see a sacrificial lamb? Am I your wife or am I just your cure?" Tae-Hyung took a step forward, the expensive fabric of his dark suit rustling. He reached out as if to touch her face, but his hand hovered in the air, trembling. He was the man who had ordered executions without blinking, yet he couldn't find the words to lie to her now. The cost of the choice he had made months ago was finally coming due, and the interest was his own heart. "The ritual required a vessel," he finally admitted, his voice cracking. "I was dying, Sora. The syndicate needed a leader and the curse was taking everything. You were the perfect match." "A vessel," she repeated, the word tasting like poison. She looked down at her pregnant stomach, the realization hitting her with a fresh wave of agony. "And the baby? Is he just the final stage of your survival? Once he is born and the last lamp is lit, what happens to me?" Tae-Hyung couldn't look her in the eye. He turned away, staring into the dark shadows of the room. "I'm trying to find another way," he whispered, but they both knew the Oracle's laws were written in blood. Sora stepped back, the emotional distance between them now wider than any ocean. She looked at the man she had begun to love, seeing only the monster who had used her innocence to buy his own life. "You didn't marry me, Tae-Hyung," she said with a haunting finality. "You just rented a life to pay your own debt, but you'll find that the cost of my soul is more than you can ever afford." The air inside the Moon Manor was colder than the winter winds howling against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Tae-Hyung's private study. Sora stood by the door, holding a tray with a bowl of ginger soup she had spent an hour perfecting. She had noticed his lingering cough and the way his hand trembled slightly when he reached for his glass, signs that the curse was beginning to gnaw at his strength again. "Tae-Hyung, you haven't eaten since the board meeting," she said softly, her voice a fragile bridge across the vast, dark room. Tae-Hyung didn't look up from his monitors. The blue light of the screens cast sharp, skeletal shadows across his face, making him look more like a marble statue than a man. Inside, however, his heart was a chaotic storm. Every time Sora entered a room, the clinical detachment he had spent a lifetime perfecting began to crumble. He found himself memorizing the way her hair fell over her shoulder and the scent of jasmine that followed her, a scent that now felt like a suffocating reminder of what he was destined to do to her. "Leave it and get out," he snapped, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Sora flinched but didn't move. She walked closer, placing the tray on the edge of the mahogany desk. "The doctor said you need to keep your warmth up. Please, just a few sips." As she reached out to adjust the napkin, her fingers brushed against his hand. To Sora, it was a gesture of care. To Tae-Hyung, it was an electric jolt that threatened to shatter his resolve. He looked at her then, and for a fleeting second, his icy gaze softened. He saw the genuine worry in her eyes, the eyes of a girl who was supposed to be his sacrifice, yet looked at him as if he were someone worth saving. The realization terrified him. If he loved her, he couldn't kill her. And if he didn't kill her, he would die, leaving his empire to be torn apart by hyenas like Francis Larkin. To save himself, he had to remain a monster. He violently swept his arm across the desk, sending the tray and the porcelain bowl crashing to the floor. The soup splattered against Sora's hem, and the sound of breaking ceramic echoed like a gunshot. "Do you think a bowl of soup changes what this is?" he roared, standing up so abruptly his chair toppled back. He stepped into her personal space, his shadow engulfing her. "You are not my wife, Sora. You are an asset, a tool. You are here because your blood is useful to me, not because I want your company." Sora's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. The quiet fear from their first meeting returned, but underneath it was a new, sharper pain, the pain of a heart that had mistakenly begun to hope. "I'm trying to help you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't need help from a girl I bought from a hospital lobby," he sneered, though the words felt like he was swallowing broken glass. He gripped her chin, forcing her to look at his cold, unreadable expression. "Stop acting like this is a fairy tale. Stay in your room, stay out of my sight, and remember your place. You are a vessel, nothing more." He pushed her away, turning his back to her so she wouldn't see the agony in his eyes. He listened to the sound of her retreating footsteps and the soft click of the door. Only then did he sink back into his chair, his breath hitching as he stared at the shattered porcelain on the floor, a mirror of the choice he had just made. He had protected his life, but he could feel his soul withering in the dark. The grand ballroom of the Moon Syndicate's private estate was a sea of obsidian silk and shimmering diamonds, a place where power didn't just talk, it whispered in threats. Sora stood at the top of the marble staircase, her breath hitching in her throat. She wore a gown of midnight blue that seemed to capture the very essence of the evening sky, its soft fabric a stark contrast to the rigid, cold environment. For months, she had been the ghost bride, hidden away in the manor, but tonight, Tae-Hyung had demanded her presence. He needed to show the world that the moon lineage was secure, yet as she began her descent, the room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. Tae-Hyung stood at the center of the floor, surrounded by elder men with predatory eyes. He had spent the last hour discussing assets and expansions, his mind focused on the clinical progression of the ritual. The second lamp was burning bright at home. He felt stronger than he had in years, while Sora grew paler by the day. To him, she was a battery, a beautiful, necessary sacrifice. But as he looked up and saw her, the practiced lie caught in his throat. Sora didn't walk with the practiced arrogance of the Mafia elite. She moved with a quiet, resilient grace that made the glittering socialites look like glass trinkets. As she reached the floor, several high-ranking investors and even a few rival doctors from the university approached her. She spoke with a brilliance that surpassed her age, discussing medical ethics and surgical advancements with a passion that lit up her eyes, a light he had been systematically trying to extinguish. Tae-Hyung watched from the shadows, a glass of vintage scotch forgotten in his hand. He saw a young doctor laugh at something she said, his hand lingering a second too long on her arm. A sudden, violent surge of possessiveness tore through Tae-Hyung, sharper than any pain the curse had ever inflicted. He realized with a jolt of terror that he wasn't just looking at his cure. He was looking at a woman who held the only piece of humanity he had left. He stepped through the crowd, his presence parting the guests like a blade. When he reached her, he didn't offer a polite greeting. He placed a heavy, dominant hand on the small of her back, pulling her flush against his suit. The warmth of her body seeped through his jacket, and for the first time, he felt a genuine heartbeat beneath his ribs, not the rhythmic thrum of a machine, but the frantic, living pulse of a man in love. "You're done talking," he murmured into her ear, his voice a low, dangerous growl that sent shivers down her spine. Sora looked up at him, her eyes searching his for a trace of the monster she feared, but all she found was a desperate, haunting hunger. In that moment, surrounded by the empire he had killed to protect, Tae-Hyung realized the catastrophic truth. He had finally found the one thing worth living for, and he was the one who had already signed its death warrant. The gala continued around them, a blur of music and light, but for Tae-Hyung, the world had narrowed down to the fragile woman in his arms. The woman he realized, with a sinking heart, he could no longer afford to lose. The afternoon sun filtered through the high, arched windows of the Moon estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floor. Sora sat in the sunroom, her hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her stomach. The silence of the mansion usually felt like a weight, but today it was punctuated by the rhythmic clinking of fine china. Across from her sat Frances Larkin. She was the picture of syndicate royalty, poised, elegant, and radiating a coldness that even the summer heat couldn't thaw. She had arrived unannounced, claiming she wanted to clear the air before the board meeting. "You look pale, Sora," Frances remarked, her voice smooth as silk but twice as sharp. "Carrying the moon air is a heavy burden for a girl of your modest constitution. I've brought a special blend of herbal tea. It's a family recipe used to soothe the nerves of expectant mothers in our circle." She poured a steaming amber liquid into a delicate porcelain cup and pushed it toward Sora. Sora hesitated. Her medical training whispered a warning at the strange, metallic scent rising from the steam, but Frances's eyes were expectant, predatory. Just as Sora's fingers brushed the handle, the heavy oak doors of the sunroom swung open with a violent crash. Tae-Hyung entered, his dark suit disheveled and his expression a mask of lethal fury. He didn't say a word as he crossed the room in 3 long strides. Before Sora could react, he reached out, grabbed the cup from her hand, and dashed it against the marble floor. The porcelain shattered into 1,000 jagged teeth, and the amber liquid hissed against the stone. "Tae-Hyung, what is the meaning of?" Frances began, standing up with a look of feigned affront. Tae-Hyung didn't let her finish. He moved with the speed of a strike, his hand closing around Frances's throat, pinning her back against the high-backed chair. The air in the room vanished, replaced by a suffocating, murderous tension. Sora gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the man she thought she knew transform into a true monster. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" Tae-Hyung's voice was a low, guttural growl that vibrated with suppressed violence. "You bribed the apothecary. You thought you could cleanse my bloodline by erasing the only thing that matters to me." Frances clawed at his hand, her face turning a bruised shade of purple. It was for the syndicate," she wheezed. "The syndicate is mine," Tae-Hyung hissed, leaning in until his lips were inches from her ear. "And she is mine. If you even breathe the same air as her again, I won't just exile you. I will erase the Larkin name from every ledger in Asia. Do you understand?" He flung her aside as if she were nothing more than trash. Frances collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her composure utterly destroyed. Tae-Hyung didn't spare her another glance. He turned to Sora, his chest heaving. For a split second, the lethal mask slipped, revealing a raw, terrifying desperation in his eyes. He reached out as if to touch her cheek, but his hand was shaking, whether from rage or the fear of what he almost lost, Sora couldn't tell. She flinched instinctively, the luxury of the room suddenly feeling like the deadliest cage of all. The moon hung low over the syndicate's estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the marble floors of the nursery that Tae-Hyung had built like a gilded cage. Sora sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, her hand resting heavily on the curve of her stomach. She was 7 months along now, and the pregnancy felt less like a blessing and more like a physical anchor dragging her toward an inevitable depth. Every kick from the life growing inside her was a bittersweet reminder of the bargain she had struck in that rain-slicked hospital hallway. A life for a life. The weight was not just in her body, but in the stifling atmosphere of the manor. The air seemed to grow thinner as the ritual reached its zenith. Across the room, the 3 lunar lamps flickered with an eerie, unnatural luminescence. 2 were now extinguished, their dark wicks signifying that the transfer was almost complete. Tae-Hyung stood by the fireplace, his silhouette sharp and imposing. He looked stronger than he had in years. The gray pallor that once haunted his skin was gone, replaced by a terrifying, vital glow. He was being restored, second by second, as Sora's own strength began to wane. He turned to look at her, his unreadable eyes tracing the exhaustion written in the slump of her shoulders. For months, he had played the role of the devoted husband, providing the best doctors and the finest silks, but the mask was beginning to fracture under the pressure of his own mounting regret. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the heavy rugs. When he reached her, he knelt, placing a hand over hers on the swell of her belly. "You're pale, Sora," he murmured, his voice a low rasp that vibrated with a tension he couldn't hide. "The doctors say you need more rest." Sora didn't pull away, but she didn't look at him either. Her gaze remained fixed on the final lamp, its flame dancing mockingly. "Is it the doctors saying that, Tae-Hyung, or is it the oracle warning you that the vessel needs to last just a few more weeks?" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Tae-Hyung's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. He felt the flutter of the child beneath his palm, his heir, his survival, and his greatest sin. The cost of his life was standing right in front of him, fading like a dying star so that he could shine. The emotional distance she maintained was a weapon she used with quiet, devastating precision. She was physically close enough to touch, yet she was miles away. Already mourning a future she knew she wouldn't see. "I didn't think it would feel like this," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. The dominant, controlled Mafia boss was gone for a fleeting second, replaced by a man haunted by the ghost of a choice he had already made. Sora finally turned her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears and a terrifyingly sharp clarity. "That's the difference between us, Tae-Hyung. You calculated the cost in gold and blood. You forgot to calculate the cost to your soul." As the clock struck midnight, the final lamp flared bright blue, illuminating the room in a cold, ghostly light. The 7-month mark had arrived. The countdown to the final sacrifice had begun, and for the first time, the man who had everything realized he was about to be left with nothing. The air inside the Moon Syndicate's ancestral hall was thick with the scent of aged sandalwood and cold, impending death. Tae-Hyung V. Moon stood at the center of the room, his dark suit absorbing the meager light, his expression a mask of charcoal-cold stone. Around him sat the elders, a circle of silver-haired men whose power was rooted in blood and ancient, cruel superstitions. They were not looking at him. They were looking at the third lunar lamp, its wick dry and waiting. "The alignment is perfect, Tae-Hyung," the eldest member rasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. "The girl's pregnancy has reached the zenith of its spiritual harvest. Your veins are clearing, your strength is returning, but the transfer is not complete. The final wick must be lit tonight." Tae-Hyung felt a phantom weight in his chest, a crushing pressure that had nothing to do with the family curse and everything to do with the woman currently locked in the east wing of his mansion. He thought of Sora, how she had looked that morning, her small hand resting protectively over the swell of her stomach, her eyes filled with a terrifying, quiet dignity. She knew. She had found the scrolls, and yet she hadn't begged for her life. She had only asked if the child would be safe from his shadow. "The ritual can wait," Tae-Hyung said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "It cannot," another elder barked, slamming a cane against the stone. "You were born to lead this syndicate, not to be led by the fleeting whims of a girl we plucked from the gutters. She was never a wife, Tae-Hyung. She was a vessel. A filter to catch the rot in your blood so you could stand where you are now. If you do not extinguish her light to save yours, the curse will rebound. You will die by dawn, and the moon legacy ends with you." The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, creeping up the walls like ink in water. Tae-Hyung realized with a sickening clarity that he had built his empire on the bones of the innocent, but for the first time, the cost was a price he could no longer calculate. The elders rose in unison, their movements synchronized and predatory. They weren't just demanding a ritual, they were staging a coup of his conscience. "Bring her to the altar," the High Elder commanded, "or we will send the enforcers to drag her here. The choice is survival or extinction, Tae-Hyung. Choose your life or choose the grave." Tae-Hyung's hand went to the concealed holster beneath his jacket, his fingers twitching against the cold steel. The cost of the choice wasn't a future haunting, it was here, breathing in the silence of the hall. He looked at the empty lamp and saw not a ritual, but a murder. As the doors to the hall creaked open to admit the armed guards, Tae-Hyung realized that to save himself, he would have to kill the only part of him that was still human. The tension in the room snapped like a violin string, and the air turned frigid as the first guard stepped forward to fulfill the elder's bloody decree. The cold, relentless rain of Xiangzhou hammered against the pavement, mirroring the frantic rhythm of Sora's pulse. She didn't look back at the iron gates of the Moon Manor, the place she had once mistaken for a sanctuary. In her hand, she clutched the crumpled, tear-stained documents she had stolen from Tae-Hyung's private study, the lunar ritual scrolls that detailed her own expiration date. She wasn't a wife. She was a biological shield, a human lightning rod designed to absorb a curse that didn't belong to her. Every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. The weight of her 7-month pregnancy made every step an agony, but the adrenaline of betrayal pushed her forward. She couldn't go to the police. The Moon Syndicate owned the sirens. She couldn't go to a hospital. Tae-Hyung's name was etched into the donor plaques of every surgical wing in the city. There was only one place left where the shadows were deep enough to hide a ghost. The old Clear Water Clinic sat at the edge of the district, a crumbling brick relic where she had spent her childhood watching her grandmother dispense herbal remedies to those too poor to afford real doctors. The closed sign dangled by a single rusted chain, groaning in the wind. Sora fumbled with the spare key she kept hidden in a loose brick behind the ivy. With a heavy click, the door yielded. Inside, the air smelled of dried mugwort, dust, and faded antiseptic. It was the smell of a life she had nearly traded for a golden cage. She collapsed against the door, sliding down until her knees hit the linoleum. The darkness was absolute, save for the rhythmic flash of a distant blue neon sign reflecting in the puddles outside. "We're safe," she whispered, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her stomach. "He won't find us here. He thinks I'm too weak to leave the luxury he bought me." But as she sat in the dark, the silence of the clinic felt heavy with the memory of Tae-Hyung's voice. "I will give you the life of a queen," he had promised. She realized now that even a queen is just a piece on a board, sacrificed to protect the king. She looked at her wrist, where the faint lunar birthmark seemed to throb with a dull, sickly heat. The second lamp had already been extinguished. She could feel her own vitality draining, a slow leak she had attributed to the pregnancy, but now knew was the ritual taking its toll. She dragged herself up and began to move with a renewed, desperate focus. She gathered old gauze, a discarded scalpel, and bottles of saline. If she was going to die to save a Mafia boss's bloodline, she would do it on her own terms, in the only house that had ever known her real name. She wasn't just a medical student anymore. She was a woman performing the most important surgery of her life, the amputation of her heart from the man who had turned her love into a death sentence. Outside, the screech of tires echoed in the distance, and Sora froze, her eyes widening as the headlights of a black sedan swept across the clinic's dusty windows. The hunt had begun. The silence inside Moon Manor was no longer the quiet of luxury. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a mausoleum. Tae-Hyung stood in the center of the master's suite, his hand trembling as it hovered over the silk pillow where Sora's head had rested only hours before. The scent of her, a faint, clean trace of medicinal herbs and rain, clung to the fabric, a cruel reminder of the life he had systematically drained to fuel his own survival. He looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in years, the dark veins of the moon curse were invisible beneath his skin. He felt strong, his pulse steady and vigorous, but as he surveyed the cold marble floors and the vaulted ceilings of his empire, he felt a hollow ache that no ritual could cure. He had traded his illness for a ghost. "Find her," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. His head of security, a man who had witnessed Tae-Hyung execute rivals without blinking, stood by the door, hesitant. "Sir, the elders, they are celebrating. They believe the transition is complete. If we mobilize the syndicate for a personal matter now." Tae-Hyung turned, and the sheer ferocity in his eyes silenced the man. The icy, controlled boss was gone, replaced by a predator driven by a primal, desperate panic. I don't care about the elders. I don't care about the syndicate. If she is not back under this roof by dawn, there will be no empire left to lead. I will burn every street in this city until I find the woman I've murdered with my own selfishness. He stormed through the halls, his heavy footsteps echoing like thunder through the empty house. Every corner of the mansion mocked him. There was the library where she had spent nights hunched over medical textbooks, trying to build a future he knew she wouldn't have. There was the garden where she had once smiled at a blooming jasmine, a smile he had documented only to ensure his vessel was healthy. He realized now that the mansion had never been his sanctuary. It was a cage. And without Sora's light, the shadows were closing in. He felt the weight of every cold word he had thrown at her, every transactional glance, every time he had looked at her and seen a cure instead of a wife. "Sora!" he roared into the darkness of the foyer, but only the hollow echo of his own voice returned. He climbed into the back of his sedan, his fingers digging into the leather upholstery. He didn't need the oracle or the lamps anymore. He needed the girl who had treated his wounds with trembling hands while he was planning her end. As the car sped out of the iron gates and into the weeping city, Tae-Hyung realized the terrifying truth. He had won his life back, but in the process, he had turned his world into a tomb. He was no longer running from a curse. He was running toward the only person who could forgive him for the monster he had become. The manhunt had begun, but he wasn't just searching for a runaway wife. He was hunting for the remains of his own soul. The cold, clinical smell of the free clinic was a world away from the sandalwood and expensive marble of Moon Manor. Tae-Hyung stood in the shadows of the doorway, his charcoal suit looking like a dark stain against the peeling white paint of the hallway. His breath hitched as he watched Sora. She was thinner than he remembered, her face pale under the flickering fluorescent lights, but her hands were steady as she bandaged a young boy's scraped knee. She was exactly where she belonged, healing others, while he remained exactly what he had always been, the source of the wound. He stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his Italian leather shoes. Sora froze. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. The very air in the room seemed to drop in temperature, heavy with the weight of a past she had tried to bury. "You shouldn't have come here, Tae-Hyung," she whispered, her voice devoid of the warmth she had just shown the child. She stood up, smoothing her simple cotton apron, her eyes meeting his with a chilling emotional distance. "The ritual is done. You got your life back. You have your syndicate. Why can't you leave me with the nothingness I have left?" Tae-Hyung took a step closer, his hand reaching out instinctively before he pulled it back, fearing his touch would burn her. For the first time in his life, the dominant, unreadable mask of the Moon Syndicate boss was cracked. The tension in his eyes wasn't from a curse or a rival's threat. It was the raw, jagged edge of a man haunted by the cost of his own survival. "I thought I wanted to live more than anything," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I thought the power was the only thing that could fill the void the curse left behind. But the silence in that house is louder than any prophecy, Sora. Every breath I take feels like a theft because I know I stole it from your happiness." Sora let out a sharp, hollow laugh that cut deeper than any blade. "You didn't just steal my happiness, Tae-Hyung. You used me as a shield. You watched me fall in love with a man who was counting down the days until my execution. Do the lamps burn brightly now? Is your blood pure?" "I don't care about the lamps," Tae-Hyung suddenly roared, his control snapping. He closed the distance between them, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was firm but trembling. "I don't care about the lineage, the chairmanship, or the cursed blood in my veins. If the price of living is a world where you look at me with that much hate, then I'd rather the curse had taken me." He leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing in a rare moment of surrender. The V of the Moon Syndicate was gone. There was only a man drowning in the consequences of a selfish choice. "I don't want the cure anymore, Sora. I just want you. Even if you never forgive me, even if you spend the rest of your life reminding me of what a monster I am, just let me be near you." Sora remained stiff, her body a cage of unresolved grief. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the life force he had preserved at her expense, and for a second the familiar scent of his cologne nearly broke her. But the memory of the sacrificial scrolls was a wall he couldn't climb. She pulled away slowly, leaving his arms empty in the middle of the quiet clinic. "You saved your life, Tae-Hyung," she said softly, turning back to her medical supplies. "Now you have to find a way to live it." "But you don't get to live it with me." The sky over the city didn't just turn gray. It bruised, a deep, sickly purple that mirrored the growing rot within the Moon Syndicate. Tae-Hyung sat in his darkened study, the silence of the manor pressing against his eardrums like a physical weight. On the mahogany desk before him sat the 3 lunar lamps. 2 were dark, their wax spent, representing the health and power he had reclaimed. The 3rd stood tall, unlit, waiting for the final breath of the ritual. He had spent the last 48 hours trying to find a way to break the contract, to reverse the flow of fate that was slowly draining the color from Sora's cheeks. But the Syndicate was a machine built on blood, and its gears were turning against him. A sudden, sharp vibration on his phone shattered the silence. It wasn't a call, it was a security alert from the safe house where he had tucked Sora away under the guise of a medical retreat. His heart, once a cold stone, hammered against his ribs with a frantic human terror. He didn't wait for his guards. He didn't reach for his coat. He ran. By the time Tae-Hyung reached the secluded villa, the iron gates hung off their hinges like broken limbs. The air smelled of ozone and expensive cologne, the signature scent of Elder Vaughn, the man who had mentored Tae-Hyung in the art of cruelty. Inside, the living room was a wreckage of Sora's life. Her medical textbooks were scattered across the floor, their pages torn. A half-knitted baby blanket lay discarded in a pool of spilled tea. There was no sign of a struggle, which was far worse. It meant she had gone quietly to protect the life inside her. Tae-Hyung's knees hit the hardwood floor. He picked up a small, silver stethoscope Sora had saved months to buy, a symbol of the future he had promised to protect while secretly planning to extinguish it. A cold, electronic chime echoed through the room. A tablet on the coffee table flickered to life, revealing a grainy video feed. Sora was strapped to a stone chair in the damp, subterranean depths of the ancestral Moon Temple. She looked small, her white maternity dress stark against the weeping stone walls. Behind her stood the elders, their faces masked in ritualistic silk. "You hesitated, Tae-Hyung," Elder Vaughn's voice crackled through the speakers, devoid of emotion. "You forgot that the Moon Boss is not a man, but a vessel. You refused to light the final lamp, so we will do it for you. The ritual requires the sacrifice to be completed at the peak of the lunar eclipse. That is in 3 hours." Sora looked directly into the camera. Her eyes weren't filled with the terrified plea of a victim. They were filled with a devastating, quiet pity. "Don't come for me, Tae-Hyung," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Save yourself. That's what this was always about, wasn't it?" The screen went black. Tae-Hyung stared at his own reflection in the glass, seeing for the first time the monster he had become. He had forced her into this cage to save his own life, and now the doors were locking from the inside. The cost of his survival was no longer a theoretical price. It was the only light he had ever truly known. The storm outside the Moon Syndicate's ancestral temple was no longer just a weather event. It felt like the sky itself was screaming in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of sandalwood and old blood. Tae-Hyung V. Moon stood before the ancient stone altar, his dark suit disheveled, his eyes hollowed by a haunting realization. On the altar sat the final lunar lamp, its wick dry, waiting for the spark that would seal Sora's fate. For generations, the Moon Men had survived by trading the lives of the innocent for their own longevity. It was a cold, mathematical equation Tae-Hyung had accepted since childhood. But as he gripped the silver lighter, his hand trembled, a physical weakness he had never known. He looked toward the shadows where Sora lay bound. She was pale, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The ritual had already begun to drain her. The red string of fate that connected them was now a literal conduit, pulling the vitality from her veins to mend the darkness in his. "Finish it, Tae-Hyung," the elder's voice rasped from the corner of the chamber, cold and demanding. "The moon is at its zenith. Light the lamp or the curse will reclaim you before dawn. Think of the syndicate. Think of the empire you've built." Tae-Hyung looked at the empire, a cold, marble room filled with old men who smelled of death, and then he looked at Sora. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his through the haze of her pain. There was no anger in her expression, only a devastating, quiet pity. "You were always so afraid of dying, Tae-Hyung," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "But look at you. You aren't even living." Words cut deeper than any assassin's blade. He remembered the way she had looked while studying her medical books by the dim light of his library, the way she had treated his wounds with such careful, unearned tenderness. He had forced her into this cage to save himself, believing that survival was the ultimate victory. But standing at the point of no return, he realized the cost. To light this lamp was to live forever in a world where the only person who truly saw his soul was gone by his own hand. The elders stepped forward, their shadows stretching like claws toward the altar. "The time is now, light it." Tae-Hyung flicked the lighter. The small flame danced, reflecting in his icy, tear-brimmed eyes. He leaned toward the final lamp, the wick inches from the fire. The atmosphere grew heavy, a static charge building in the room that made the very air vibrate. Sora's heart rate spiked on the monitor beside her, a frantic drumming that signaled the end. In that heartbeat, the dominant, controlled Mafia boss vanished. In his place stood a man haunted by the weight of 1,000 wrong choices. He looked at the lamp, the vessel of his salvation and her execution, and realized that some curses weren't meant to be broken by a ritual, but by a sacrifice of a different kind. The flame touched the wick, the oil caught, and a blinding, unnatural light filled the temple, marking the moment the choice was made, and the haunting began. The sky over the Moon Syndicate's ancestral estate didn't just turn dark. It turned a bruised, sickly purple, as if the heavens themselves were recoiling from what was about to take place. Thunder rumbled with a tectonic frequency, shaking the reinforced glass of the master suite where Sora Bay lay. Outside, the city was being swallowed by a deluge, the rain lashing against the stone walls like 1,000 frantic fingers trying to claw their way inside. Tae-Hyung V. Moon stood by the window, his silhouette sharp and predatory against the intermittent flashes of lightning. In his hand, he held the ritual dagger, a cold, ceremonial relic meant to sever the last tie of the curse. The air in the room was thick with the scent of ozone and burning incense, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that made every breath Sora took feel like a struggle. She was pale, her skin almost translucent under the flickering candlelight, her eyes fixed on the man she had mistakenly begun to trust. "The wind is screaming, Tae-Hyung," Sora whispered, her voice barely audible over the crashing thunder. She clutched the silk sheets, her knuckles white. "Even the world knows this is wrong." Tae-Hyung didn't turn. His gaze remained fixed on the storm, his jaw set in a line of rigid iron. He could feel the coldness in his own veins, the terminal chill of the moon bloodline beginning to recede, replaced by a surge of unnatural vitality. The ritual was working. As the second lamp flickered and died, he felt stronger than he had in years, but as he looked at Sora's reflection in the glass, he saw the cost. She was fatting. The vibrant, resilient woman who had spent her nights studying medicine to save others was being drained of her very essence to save a monster. "It's not about right or wrong anymore, Sora," he replied, his voice a low, melodic growl that vibrated with suppressed pain. "It's about survival. This is the legacy I was born into. This is the price of the throne." Suddenly, a crack of lightning split the sky, so close that the lights in the mansion flickered and died, plunging them into a world lit only by the guttering flames of the ritual candles. In that momentary darkness, the shadows seemed to stretch and come alive. The elders were waiting downstairs, their silent presence a physical weight on the house. They expected the third lamp to be extinguished by midnight. Sora let out a sharp gasp of pain, clutching her abdomen. The child, the heir who was never meant to have a mother, stirred violently. Tae-Hyung finally turned, his composure fracturing as he saw her collapse against the pillows. For a heartbeat, the Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man haunted by the looming shadow of his own choices. He moved toward her, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her forehead. She was burning with fever, yet shivering. The storm outside reached a crescendo, a window in the far hallway shattering under the pressure, letting the cold, wet wind howl through the corridors of the Moon Manor. The ritual had reached its peak, and the night of reckoning had finally arrived. The sky over Xingzhou didn't just rain, it mourned. Thunder shook the foundations of the Moon Syndicate's private wing, a rhythmic drumming that mimicked the frantic heartbeats of the medical staff rushing through the sterilized corridors. Inside the delivery suite, the air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the sterile scent of ozone. Tae-Hyung V. Moon stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the flashes of lightning. He was the most powerful man in the city, the man who had successfully transferred his curse and reclaimed his health. Yet as he listened to Sora's ragged, weakening gasps, he felt like a ghost. He looked down at his hands, steady and strong for the first time in years, and felt a wave of nausea. Every ounce of vitality he now possessed had been siphoned from the woman currently dying 10 feet away from him. Her blood pressure is bottoming out, a nurse cried, the monitor's steady beep, beep, dissolving into a panicked, continuous whine. Tae-Hyung turned, his icy composure finally shattering. Sora lay beneath the harsh surgical lights, her skin the color of translucent marble. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together too many times. Her eyes, usually full of a defiant, radiant light, were unfocused, drifting toward the ceiling as if she were already looking at a world beyond this one. "Sora," he whispered, his voice cracking. He lunged to her side, grabbing her hand. It was ice cold. "Sora, stay with me. You're a doctor, remember? You told me you were going to save lives. You can't stop now." She turned her head with agonizing slowness. A single tear traced a path through the sweat on her temple. "The cost," she wheezed, her voice barely a thread. You paid it, Tae-Hyung, but you used my soul to buy it." "I'll give it back," he roared at the doctors, his eyes wild with a terrifying, helpless rage. "Take it back. Whatever the ritual did, reverse it. Take my blood, take my heart, just save her." The head surgeon didn't look up, his hands deep in the red chaos of the surgery. "There is no revering fate, Mr. Moon. The child is coming, but she has nothing left to give. She's empty." A final, gut-wrenching scream tore from Sora's throat, followed by a sudden, heavy silence that felt louder than the thunder outside. Then, a thin, wailing cry pierced the room. The heir to the Moon Syndicate had arrived, a beautiful, healthy boy born of a mother who was fading into a shadow. Tae-Hyung didn't look at the child. He only looked at Sora. Her hand went limp in his, her fingers slipping through his grasp like water. The monitor flatlined. The steady, horizontal line on the screen was a mocking reflection of the cold, linear life Tae-Hyung had chosen for himself. He had won his life, he had won his empire, and he had won his heir. But as he looked at Sora's still, silent face, he realized he had never been more truly dead. The cost of his choice hadn't just haunted him, it had finally come to collect. The sterile white walls of the private surgical wing felt like they were closing in, crushing the air out of Tae-Hyung's lungs. Outside, the thunderstorm that had been brewing all night finally broke, lightning illuminating the stark, haunted lines of his face as he paced the corridor. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to mock him, a dark reminder of the ritual he had initiated and the lamps he had lit with his own hands. For years, he had lived for the Syndicate, viewing people as fuel for his own survival. But as the muffled sounds of the medical team's struggle drifted through the heavy doors, he realized he had traded the only light in his life for a crown of cold iron. Suddenly, the rhythmic, electronic chirping of the heart monitor inside changed. The steady beat faltered, skipped, and then elongated into a single, piercing flatline. The sound sliced through Tae-Hyung like a physical blade. He froze, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. The moon curse was gone. He could feel the unnatural coldness in his veins finally thawing, replaced by a searing, agonizing heat. The ritual was successful. The transfer was complete. He was healthy, he was powerful, and he was utterly alone. He burst into the room, ignoring the nurses who tried to hold him back. Sora lay on the table, her face as pale as the silk sheets of their wedding night. She looked smaller than he remembered, a delicate bird broken by the weight of his sins. The doctor stepped back, his head bowed in a silence that felt louder than the thunder outside. "Get back to work," Tae-Hyung hissed, his voice cracking with a desperation that the Moon Syndicate's feared leader had never known. "I didn't give you permission to stop." He pushed past the surgeon and grabbed Sora's hand. It was cooling, the warmth of her life having been siphoned away to fuel his own heartbeat. In that moment, the chairman of the syndicate, the man who wanted to outrun fate, finally hit the ground. He fell to his knees beside the table, pressing her lifeless hand against his cheek. "Sora, wake up," he whispered, a ragged, broken sound. "I'll give it back. I don't want the empire. I don't want the life. Take it back." The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the machines that no longer had a soul to track. Tae-Hyung looked at the 3 extinguished lamps on the ritual altar in the corner. He had won. He had survived. But as he looked at Sora's peaceful, unmoving face, he realized the oracle was right. The cost was absolute. His world hadn't just changed, it had ended. The man he used to be was dead, and the man he had become was a ghost, haunted by the memory of the innocent girl he had forced into a marriage that became her grave. He let out a low, guttural cry of grief that was lost in the roar of the storm, marking the beginning of a haunting that would last a lifetime. The silence inside the Moon Syndicate's ancestral hall was not the peace of a sanctuary, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes an execution. Outside, the storm that had raged during Sora's death had slowed to a rhythmic, mournful drip, but inside Tae-Hyung's chest, the tempest was only beginning to peak. He sat at the head of the long, obsidian table, his dark suit blending into the shadows. Before him sat the 7 elders, men who had lived decades on the blood and labor of others, the very architects of the ritual that had supposedly claimed Sora's life. They looked at him with a mixture of pride and caution, seeing a man whose skin was no longer pale with the curse, but vibrant with a stolen health. The ritual was a success. Tae-Hyung, the eldest member, a man with skin like parchment, spoke with a thin smile. "The Moon lineage is secure. The girl was a small price to pay for the longevity of our empire. You should be grateful." Tae-Hyung didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the empty space beside him where Sora should have been sitting, laughing or perhaps looking at him with that quiet, defiant empathy he had come to crave. The health in his veins felt like liquid fire, a constant, burning reminder that he was breathing because she was not. "Grateful?" Tae-Hyung's voice was a low, guttural rasp. He slowly stood, the chair screeching against the marble floor like a dying animal. "I didn't want an empire built on her ashes. I wanted her." "She was a tool, boy," another elder snapped, his voice trembling with sudden nerves. "A scapegoat, that was the bargain." "Then the bargain is over," Tae-Hyung said. With a movement so fast it seemed blurred, he drew the ceremonial blade from the table. The same blade intended to mark the final stage of the ritual. The first elder didn't even have time to scream. The steel was cold, clinical, and final. Tae-Hyung didn't feel the thrill of victory. He felt only a hollow, mechanical necessity. One by one, he moved through the room. The men who had whispered that Sora was expendable now found their own lives to be the same. His guards stood at the doors, faces turned away. They knew better than to interfere with a man who had already lost his soul. Tae-Hyung didn't stop until the obsidian table was stained with a different kind of ritual. He stood in the center of the carnage, his breath hitching as he looked at his hands, the hands that had once held Sora's trembling fingers, now covered in the filth of his own making. He dropped the blade, the clatter echoing off the high ceilings. The elders were gone, the syndicate was his, and the curse was broken. Yet, as he looked into the darkness of the hall, he realized the oracle had lied about one thing. The ritual hadn't transferred his misfortune to Sora. It had simply transformed it. He was no longer dying of a blood curse. He was now condemned to a life of absolute power in a world that was utterly, devastatingly empty. The cost of his survival wasn't her death. It was the eternal haunting of his own conscience. The terminal coldness that once threatened to stop Tae-Hyung's heart was gone, replaced by a rhythmic, steady pulse that felt like a mockery. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moon Syndicate's penthouse, watching the city of Xiingzhou breathe in the twilight. His skin was warm, his breathing was effortless, and the dark veins that had once signaled his impending death had receded completely. The ritual was a success. The curse was broken. He was a man with a future, yet as he caught his reflection in the glass, he saw only a hollow shell. The penthouse was silent, the air heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood, and the sterile smell of a life too carefully managed. He had everything he had once bartered his soul for: absolute power, the fear of his rivals, and a body that no longer betrayed him. But the cost was written in the quiet corners of the room where Sora's medical books still sat, untouched and gathering a thin layer of silver dust. He walked to the small mahogany desk where she used to sit late into the night. He traced the edge of a notebook where she had scribbled anatomical diagrams next to grocery lists for her grandmother. Every time his heart beat strongly in his chest, it felt like a theft. The health he enjoyed was a stolen treasure, looted from the girl who had looked at him with eyes full of terrifying kindness even as he was leading her to the slaughter. "Sir, the board is waiting," his assistant whispered from the doorway, his voice trembling. Tae-Hyung didn't turn. He didn't care about the board, the syndicate, or the billions in the moon accounts. He realized with a staggering weight that he had spent his entire life trying to survive, only to find that living was unbearable without the light he had extinguished. He was a ghost haunting his own kingdom. He moved through the days with a clinical precision, signing documents and ending lives with a flick of a pen, but he felt nothing. No anger, no triumph, only a vast, echoing void. He had become the monster he always feared he would be, not because of the curse, but because of the cure. He often found himself standing in the doorway of the nursery, a room finished in soft creams and gentle light, now perpetually locked. The silence there was the loudest thing in the mansion. It was a monument to the choice he had made, the choice to save himself. He had thought power would be enough to fill the hole in his chest, but as the moon rose over the city, casting a pale, cold light across the floor, Tae-Hyung, V. Moon realized he was the wealthiest man in Asia and the poorest soul on earth. He was healthy, he was whole, and he was utterly, irrevocably alone. The cost of his life had been her smile, and as the shadows lengthened, he finally understood that he had not survived the curse at all. He had simply traded one slow death for another. The heavy iron gates of the Moon Syndicate once symbolized Tae-Hyung's absolute authority, but now they felt like the bars of a self-imposed prison. 3 years had passed since the night the third lamp was shattered. 3 years since the monitors in the delivery room flatlined, and the world was told that Sora Bay had vanished into the ether of a tragic childbirth. In that time, the moon curse that had once threatened to wither Tae-Hyung's veins had been replaced by a much more agonizing affliction, a grief so sharp it felt like a physical blade lodged in his chest. Tae-Hyung stood on the edge of a construction site in the heart of the city, the cold wind whipping his charcoal overcoat around his legs. His expression remained as unreadable as ever, his eyes a void of controlled tension, but his hands were buried deep in his pockets, clenched into white-knuckled fists. Before him rose a magnificent structure of glass and white marble, a stark contrast to the dark, smoke-filled clubs and backroom offices where he spent his nights. It was the Sora Bay Memorial Hospital, a state-of-the-art medical facility designed to offer free care to the poor, the elderly, and those forgotten by society. It was the realization of a dream he had stolen from a girl who only wanted to heal the world. He had poured billions into the foundation, obsessing over every detail from the specialized neonatal units to the quiet garden where blind patients could walk in safety. He visited the site every evening at dusk, standing in the shadows of the rising beams as if he were waiting for a ghost to appear and offer him a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. His men watched him from a distance, whispering about the boss's descent into obsession. He no longer cared for the expansion of territories or the crushing of rivals. He was a man building a monument to a sacrifice he had been willing to make until the moment he realized his own soul was part of the price. Every piece of equipment, every sterile hallway, was a silent apology. He had used her as a lightning rod for his misfortune, and in return, she had left him with a hollow prosperity. He often found himself sitting in the unfinished lobby, staring at the spot where a grand portrait of Sora would eventually hang. In his mind's eye, he could still see her on that rainy night, clutching her medical books with a resilience that had eventually broken his heart. He had survived the curse, his health was perfect, and his power was absolute, yet as he looked up at the building bearing her name, the irony tasted like ash. He had saved himself only to find that he had no one left to live for. The hospital was a masterpiece of modern medicine, a sanctuary for the dying, but to Tae-Hyung, It was simply a tomb for the man he used to be and the love he had realized too late. The sterile, white corridors of the St. Jude Medical Research Center in Zurich smelled of ozone and expensive disinfectant, a world away from the humid, blood-stained streets of the Moon Syndicate's territory. Tae-Hyung stood in the shadow of a marble pillar, his charcoal suit blending into the dim lighting of the gala's foyer. He moved like a ghost through a life he no longer felt he deserved. 3 years had passed since the explosion, 3 years of physical health bought at the price of a hollow chest. The moon curse was gone, but the haunting was permanent. He had traveled across continents following whispers, pouring millions into anonymous medical grants just to see if a certain name would appear on a research roster. He told himself he was looking for closure, but the tremor in his hands suggested otherwise. Then, the heavy oak doors of the main auditorium swung open. A group of surgeons exited, deep in discussion about the afternoon's breakthrough lecture on regenerative cardiology. In the center of the group stood a woman in a lab coat that seemed to radiate a soft, clinical light. Her hair was pulled back, sharp and professional, but there was no mistaking the graceful line of her neck or the way she carried herself, with a quiet, unyielding strength. It was Sora. Tae-Hyung's breath hitched, a jagged sound that died in his throat. She looked different. The girl who had once trembled in the back of his sedan was gone. In her place was a woman of authority, her eyes clear and focused, devoid of the trapped animal fear that had once defined her. She was laughing softly at a colleague's remark, a sound so pure it felt like a knife twisting in Tae-Hyung's ribs. He had spent a lifetime taking. Seeing her now, he realized the magnitude of what he had stolen. As the crowd thinned, a small boy, no more than 3 years old, toddled out from the staff lounge, pursued by a nanny. He had a mop of dark hair and a stubborn set to his jaw that made Tae-Hyung's heart stop entirely. "Mama," the boy chirped, his voice echoing in the grand hall. Sora turned, and her entire face transformed. The professional mask melted into a look of such profound, fierce devotion that Tae-Hyung had to steady himself against the wall. She scooped the child into her arms, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The boy's eyes, wide, dark, and piercingly familiar, glanced toward the shadows where Tae-Hyung stood. For a heartbeat, Sora's gaze followed her son's. She looked directly toward the pillar. Tae-Hyung froze, his pulse thundering in his ears. The air between them turned heavy, charged with the ghost of 1,000 unspoken apologies and a betrayal that time had failed to wither. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing as if sensing a cold draft from a past life. But she didn't move toward him. She simply adjusted the child on her hip, turned her back, and walked toward the exit. She was moving toward a bright, clean future, leaving the monster of her past exactly where he belonged, in the dark. For 3 years, the skyline of Zurich had been Sora's only constant, a cold and jagged horizon that mirrored the surgical precision of her new life. As a lead researcher in regenerative medicine, she moved through the sterile white halls of the university with a ghost-like efficiency. She believed she had finally outrun the shadow of the Moon Syndicate, leaving behind the girl who was once a sacrifice for a Mafia boss's soul. But what Sora didn't know was that the very air she breathed, the high-end lab equipment, the unlimited grants, even the private security that discreetly patrolled the perimeter of her daughter's school, was paid for by a man who was supposed to be dead. Back in the heart of the syndicate, Tae-Hyung V. Moon sat in a room devoid of light, save for the glow of a single monitor. The screen displayed a grainy, long-lens photograph of Sora walking across a campus plaza, a coffee in one hand and a stack of medical journals in the other. He traced the outline of her face on the glass, his fingers trembling with a hunger he refused to feed. To the world, he was the resurrected king of the Moon Syndicate, more ruthless and powerful than ever. To Sora, he was the nightmare she had successfully buried. He preferred it that way. Every time Sora's research hit a financial bottleneck, an anonymous philanthropic foundation based in Singapore would swoop in with a multi-million-dollar endowment. When a rival pharmaceutical firm tried to sue her for patent infringement, the world's most expensive legal team appeared out of nowhere to dismantle the case before it ever reached her desk. Sora often marveled at her luck, attributing it to the universe finally balancing the scales for the horrors she had endured. She never noticed the black sedan that parked 2 blocks away from her apartment every Tuesday night, or the way the streetlights seemed to flicker whenever a suspicious figure lurked too close to her door, only for that figure to vanish into an alleyway, never to be seen again. Tae-Hyung lived for the reports. He knew the exact moment she published a breakthrough paper. He knew her daughter's favorite flavor of ice cream. He knew that Sora still wore a small, simple bandage on her finger whenever she felt stressed, a habit from her days as a desperate student. He was her silent guardian, a monster standing at the edge of her light, making sure the darkness he once represented never touched her again. He was funding her happiness with the very blood money he had once used to cage her. It was a hollow, agonizing penance. He was the ghost in her machine, the invisible hand ensuring her success, all while knowing that the closer he got to her, the more he risked destroying the peace he had spent a fortune to build. He was a man possessed by a haunting truth. He had finally learned how to love her, but the ultimate proof of that love was making sure she never saw his face again. The cold rain of London felt different than the humid storms of Xingzhou. It was sharper, more clinical, much like the life Tae-Hyung V. Moon had lived for the past 3 years. He stood across the cobblestone street from a small, independent pediatric clinic, his dark coat blending into the shadows of a stone archway. He had spent 1,000 nights imagining this moment, yet as he watched the door open, his breath hitched in a way that had nothing to do with the lingering ache of the moon curse. Sora stepped out first, adjusting a knit scarf around her neck. She looked older, her face stripped of the wide-eyed terror that had defined her time in his mansion. In its place was a quiet, formidable strength, the look of a woman who had pulled herself out of the grave he had dug for her. Behind her, a small boy no older than 3 tottered out, clutching her hand. The child had Tae-Hyung's dark, piercing eyes, but he wore a bright yellow raincoat that reflected a warmth the moon lineage had never known. Tae-Hyung's hand tightened around the silver handle of his cane. He had promised himself he would stay in the shadows, that his penance was to watch and never touch. But as the child tripped on the uneven pavement, Tae-Hyung moved before his mind could veto the impulse. He was across the street in seconds, his long strides cutting through the mist. He reached out, his gloved hand steadying the boy's shoulder just before he hit the ground. The child looked up, blinking curiously at the tall, imposing stranger in the charcoal suit. "Careful, little one," Tae-Hyung murmured, his voice cracking from years of disuse. Sora froze. The sound of that voice was a ghost she had spent 3 years exorcising. She slowly looked up, her gaze traveling from his polished shoes to the face that still haunted her dreams. Her expression didn't shatter into fear. Instead, it hardened into a cold, impenetrable wall of ice. "Let go of him," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. Tae-Hyung stood up slowly, towering over her, yet for the first time in his life, he felt small. The dominant, unreadable mask he usually wore was nowhere to be found. His eyes were raw, pleading, and heavy with the weight of every lamp he had ever extinguished. "Sora," he breathed, the name a prayer and a confession. "I didn't think. I just wanted to see if you were breathing." "I've been breathing better since the world thought I was dead," she replied, pulling the boy behind her skirts, shielding him with her body just as Tae-Hyung had once shielded her from a blast. Only now, she was shielding the boy from him. "Why are you here, Tae-Hyung? Did you run out of sacrifices? Is the curse returning?" "The curse is gone," he said, his voice trembling. "But the haunting started the moment you left. I've spent every second of the last 3 years paying for that choice." Sora looked at him, her eyes tracing the faint scar on his temple from the bombing, the only proof that he had a heart. For a fleeting second, her hand twitched as if to reach out, the radical empathy of the girl she once was flickering to life. Then, she looked at her son, and the flicker died. "You paid with money and regret," she said, stepping back into the safety of the clinic's doorway. "I paid with my life. The debt is settled. Don't come back." The cold London rain felt like needles against Tae-Hyung's skin, but he didn't move. He stood outside the glass-fronted medical plaza, his dark coat heavy with moisture, watching the woman through the window. Sora was laughing, a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound he had traded for his own survival. She was holding a toddler, a boy with the Moon family's sharp eyes but Sora's gentle smile. When she finally exited the building, the laughter vanished. She stopped dead, her umbrella tilting back as she locked eyes with the man who had once been her executioner. Tae-Hyung took a step forward, his hands trembling, a physical weakness the moon curse had never caused, but his own heart now demanded. "Sora," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign even to himself. "I've spent 3 years searching. I've built the foundations, I've cleared the syndicate, I've changed." Sora didn't flinch. She adjusted the child on her hip, her grip firm and protective. The vulnerability he had exploited in that hospital hallway years ago was gone, replaced by a tempered steel he had forged through his own cruelty. "I know who you are now, Tae-Hyung," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I saw the news. Your health is restored. The Moon Syndicate is the most powerful it has ever been. The ritual worked, didn't it? The lamps went out and you lived." "I would give it all back," he pleaded, reaching out a hand he didn't dare let touch her. "The power, the life, none of it matters if you aren't in the mansion. The cost of that choice has haunted every second of my existence." Sora looked down at her son, then back at the man in the expensive charcoal suit. "You still don't understand. You didn't just choose your life over mine. You chose a ritual over a person. You looked at me and saw a battery, a shield, a scapegoat. You didn't love me then, and you don't love me now. You just love the guilt that makes you feel human." "That's not true," he choked out, the dominant Mafia boss reduced to a beggar in the street. "I love you more than my own breath." "Then let us breathe," she countered. She stepped closer, the soft light of the street lamp catching the clinical coldness in her gaze. "You saved your life, Tae-Hyung. You fought fate and won. Now go and live that life. Live it in your high towers and your marble halls. Live it with the power you wanted so badly that you were willing to watch me die for it." She leaned in, her voice a lethal whisper. "But live it without us. Because every time I look at you, I don't see a husband. I see the man who decided my life was the price of his own. That debt is settled. Don't ever follow us again." She turned away, walking into the gray fog of the city. Tae-Hyung watched her go, the silence of the street more deafening than any explosion. He had his life, his health, and his empire. He had everything he had ever wanted, only to realize that he was truly, finally, cursed. The sky over the Moon Syndicate's private docks was a bruised purple, heavy with the scent of ozone and incoming rain. Tae-Hyung Moon stood at the edge of the pier, his dark overcoat billowing like a shroud. For 3 years, he had been a ghost haunting his own life, building hospitals and clinics in Sora's name while she lived an ocean away, unaware that the man who had nearly cost her everything was now her silent guardian. He had finally begun to believe that his penance was working, that by staying away, he was keeping her safe. But the past is a debt that is never fully settled. A low, grating laugh echoed from the shadows of a nearby warehouse, cutting through the sound of the crashing waves. From the darkness stepped a man whose face was a roadmap of scars and bitterness. Tae-Hyung. Once a high-ranking lieutenant in a rival faction, he had been dismantled by Tae-Hyung during the bloody purge following the night of the ritual. He had lost his status, his eye, and his dignity. "You look well, Chairman," Tae-Hyung spat, his voice sounding like glass grinding against stone. "The curse didn't take your life, but it certainly took your soul. You've become soft, building playgrounds and healing the sick. It's pathetic." Tae-Hyung didn't move. His expression remained the same cold, unreadable mask that had once terrified the underworld, but his eyes narrowed. "You should have stayed in the hole you crawled into, Tae-Hyung. Coming here is a death sentence." "Is it?" Tae-Hyung pulled a burner phone from his pocket, the screen glowing with a live video feed. Tae-Hyung's heart, usually a frozen stone in his chest, gave a violent thrum of terror. The video showed a quiet street in a foreign city, the very street where Sora lived. The camera zoomed in on a small, sunny playground where Sora sat on a bench, laughing as she watched a toddler with dark, unruly hair chase a ball. "She's beautiful, Tae-Hyung," Tae-Hyung whispered, stepping into the dim light. "And the boy, he has your eyes. Did you think you could just hide them away? Did you think I wouldn't find the sacrifice that survived?" Tae-Hyung's hand moved toward the holster at his small of his back, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating bass. "If you touch them, I will ensure your death lasts for days." "Threats won't stop the timer," Zioa countered, clicking a button on the phone. A rhythmic digital ticking began to play over the speakers. "I don't want your money and I don't want your empire. I want you to feel the weight of your choices. There is a device rigged to the car she's about to enter. You have 1 hour to get to the private airfield and board a flight I've prepared. You come alone or I press the button. You wanted to save yourself at her expense once before, Tae-Hyung. Let's see what you're willing to pay today." The wind picked up, howling between the containers. Tae-Hyung looked at the screen, at the woman he loved and the son he had never held, and realized that the haunting was over. The final reckoning had arrived, and this time there would be no scapegoat. The cost would be paid in full, and it would be paid in his own blood. The digital timer on the small screen inside the trunk flickered with a cold, rhythmic pulse. 60, 59, 58. The red numbers bled into the surrounding shadows of the underground parking garage, casting a macabre glow on Sora's pale, tear-streaked face. She was bound and gagged, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization that their reunion was to be their tomb. Tae-Hyung stood frozen, his hand gripping the cold steel of the handgun Zioa Chang's henchman had tossed at his feet. The voice from the speaker above them was distorted, dripping with a sadistic glee that cut through the heavy silence. "A life for a life, Mr. Moon," the voice rasped. "You used her once to save yourself from a curse. Now prove that the cost of that choice actually haunted you. Kill yourself and the bomb stops. She walks free, or stay alive. And watch the only thing you ever truly loved turn to ash in 40 seconds. Tae-Hyung didn't look at the gun. He looked at Sora. In the flickering light of the timer, he saw the innocent girl he had forced into a marriage license years ago. He saw the medical student whose dreams he had nearly extinguished for his own survival. Every cold word he had ever spoken to her, every night he had left her alone in the Moon Manor while he played God with their fates, crashed down on him like a tidal wave of lead. 30 seconds, the voice prompted. Sora thrashed against her restraints, her muffled screams pleading with him to run, to save himself, to not do it. But Tae-Hyung felt a strange, terrifying peace settle over him. For years, he had been running from a curse, a prophecy, and the crushing weight of his own guilt. He had built hospitals and saved lives from the shadows, but he had never truly paid the debt he owed her. He stepped closer to the trunk, his fingers brushing against her cheek one last time. His dominant, controlled exterior finally cracked, and for the first time, Sora saw the man behind the Mafia boss, a man who was tired of being a predator. "I spent my whole life trying to outrun death, Sora," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, bleeding sincerity. "But I never realized that living without you was the real curse." The timer hit 15. His thumb pulled back the hammer of the gun. The metallic click echoed through the concrete space like a funeral knell. He pressed the barrel against his own temple, his eyes locked onto hers, refusing to look away even as she sobbed. He wanted her to be the last thing he ever saw, not a scapegoat, not a vessel, but the woman who had taught a monster how to feel. "I'm sorry for the choice I made back then," he breathed, his finger tightening on the trigger as the timer ticked down to 5. "This time, the choice is mine." The silence of the garage was absolute, save for the frantic beating of 2 hearts and the final, shrill beep of the countdown reaching its end. The digital timer on the dashboard pulsed a rhythmic, toxic red, counting down the final 60 seconds of Tae-Hyung's life. Outside the reinforced windows of the SUV, the industrial wasteland of the Xiingzhou docks was silent, save for the distant, mocking whistle of the wind. Beside him, Sora was a statue of frozen terror, her hands trembling as she clutched the bundle in her arms. Their child, the heir he had once viewed as a mere biological milestone in a dark ritual. "Tae-Hyung, please," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry glass. "There has to be another way. You can't do this." Tae-Hyung didn't look at the bomb. He looked at her. For years, he had lived behind a veil of emotional numbness, treating the world as a game of assets and liabilities. He had forced her into his world to save himself from a curse, never realizing that the real curse was a life lived without the capacity to love. Now, as the scent of ozone and salt filled the cabin, he felt a strange, terrifying clarity. The cost of the choice wasn't her life, it was his. I spent my whole life running from a fate I thought was written in the stars, he said, his voice unusually soft, devoid of the Mafia boss's usual iron. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw one last time. But the only fate that matters is making sure you and him get to see the sun tomorrow. Don't talk like that, she sobbed, pressing her face into his palm. We can both run, we can find a way. 40 seconds, Sora. He leaned over, his shadow engulfing her in a final protective shroud. He didn't just see a victim anymore. He saw the woman who had nursed his wounds when he was a monster, the woman who had stayed when she should have fled. He reached across her, his fingers finding the door handle on her side. With a sudden, violent shove, he pushed her out of the vehicle and onto the soft silt of the dockside. Sora tumbled, shielding the baby with her body, her scream lost to the roar of the wind. Before she could scramble back, Tae-Hyung locked the doors from the inside. He watched her through the glass, the soft, gentle light of her face contrasting against the deep, moral darkness of the life he was leaving behind. He saw her lips moving, screaming his name, her hands pounding against the reinforced pain. He offered her a single, controlled nod, the unreadable tension in his eyes finally breaking into a look of absolute, devastating regret. The timer hit 0. A deafening roar swallowed the docks. A wall of orange fire and twisted metal expanded out, a violent baptism of heat that lit up the night sky. Tae-Hyung didn't feel the pain. He only felt the sudden, weightless sensation of a debt finally being paid in full. As the shockwave threw Sora back into the safety of the shadows, the last thing he saw wasn't the fire, but the memory of a girl in the rain, clutching her medical books, and the realization that he had finally, at the very end, become the man she deserved. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic hum of the life support machines had once been Sora's sanctuary, the backdrop to her dreams of becoming a healer. Now, they were the setting of her most harrowing trial. Tae-Hyung V. Moon, the man who had once stood over her like a dark god, now lay broken on a gurney before her. His charcoal suit was shredded, soaked through with the crimson cost of his final choice. He had taken the full force of the blast meant for her, shielding her with the very body he had once considered too precious to sacrifice for anyone. The emergency room was a whirlwind of motion, but Sora felt a strange, cold clarity settle over her. The frantic nurses looked to her, the lead surgeon on call, unaware that the dying man on the table was her husband, the man she had fled, the man she had tried to erase from her soul. Her hands, usually steady as stone, trembled for a fleeting second as she looked at his face. He was pale, the moon curse of his family finally being replaced by the very real mortality of a man who had loved too late. "Prepare the OR," Sora commanded, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. "Massive internal hemorrhaging, we're losing him." As she scrubbed in, the hot water scalding her skin, memories flashed against the white tiles. She remembered the night he had forced the marriage license into her hand. She remembered the coldness of his manner and the way he had once looked at her as nothing more than a vessel. But then, she remembered the warmth of his body in the trunk of that car just minutes ago, the way he had whispered her name as the timer reached 0, his last act being one of pure, unadulterated protection. Inside the operating theater, the bright LED lights were unforgiving. Sora stepped up to the table, the scalpel heavy in her hand. For years, she had imagined this moment, not saving him, but being free of him. Now his life was quite literally in her hands. The monitor wavered, a long, agonizing beep signaling his heart was failing. "Don't you dare," she whispered through her surgical mask, her eyes burning. "You don't get to leave yet. You don't get to die a hero after being my villain for so long. You owe me a lifetime of regret, Tae-Hyung." She worked with a feverish, surgical precision that bordered on the miraculous. Every stitch was a memory. Every clamped artery was a refusal to let the shadows take him. She navigated the shrapnel and the internal trauma with the expertise of a woman who had rebuilt her own life from the ashes he had left behind. For 4 hours, the only sound was the clinking of metal and her steady, rhythmic breathing. When the final internal bleed was stopped and his heart rate stabilized into a weak but consistent rhythm, Sora finally stepped back. Her surgical gown was ruined, splattered with the blood of the Moon Syndicate's king. She looked down at him, not as a victim looking at her captor, but as a doctor looking at a patient she had reclaimed from death. The power dynamic had shifted forever. She had saved his life, not because she was his scapegoat, but because she was no longer his prey. She walked out of the ore into the dim morning light, the weight of the haunting choice they had both made finally beginning to settle into a new, uncertain peace. The sterile white walls of the VIP recovery suite felt like a different kind of prison for Tae-Hyung, V. Moon. His chest was wrapped in heavy bandages, the physical ache of the blast residue a constant reminder of the moment he had finally chosen her life over his own. But as he watched Sora Bay standing by the window, silhouetted against the setting sun of a city that didn't know his name, he realized the shrapnel in his skin was nothing compared to the weight of the silence between them. She wasn't the trembling girl he had shoved into a black sedan years ago. She was a woman who had mastered the art of the scalpel. A woman who had reached into his open chest and pulled him back from the brink of death not out of love, but out of a professional oath. When she finally turned to look at him, her expression wasn't filled with the hatred he expected, nor the devotion he craved. It was a calm, devastating neutrality. "The monitors are stable," she said, her voice professional and distant. "In another week, you'll be fit to travel. I've already arranged for your private transport back to the Syndicate's territory." Tae-Hyung tried to sit up, a sharp wince catching in his throat. "Sora, I didn't stay behind in that building because I wanted to be a hero. I stayed because I realized that the moon curse wasn't something written in the stars. It was the choices I made. It was the way I looked at you and saw a cure instead of a person." Sora walked to the foot of his bed, her hands resting on the clipboard. For a fleeting second, the cold mask slipped, and he saw the haunting flicker of the girl who had once treated his wounds in the dark of a library. "You saved me, Tae-Hyung. You saved our son, and for that I will never wish you ill again, but don't mistake my gratitude for an erasure of the past. I would spend 1,000 lifetimes trying to buy back your smile," he whispered, his voice cracking with the vulnerability he had spent his life suppressing. "Then start by living," she replied softly. "Go back, dismantle the traditions that demanded my life, be the man who doesn't need a scapegoat." She moved toward the door, her hand pausing on the handle. She didn't look back, but she didn't leave immediately either. In that pause, there was a sliver of something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but was no longer the death sentence of her silence. "Is there a chance?" he asked, the most powerful man in the syndicate reduced to a beggar. "The cost of your choice was my trust, Tae-Hyung. That isn't something you can buy or win in a war. It's something that has to grow in the space you leave me." She stepped out, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the room. Tae-Hyung closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the pillow. The haunting memories of the ritual lamps and the cold marriage license remained, shadows that would follow them both forever. But as he watched the first star appear in the darkening sky, he felt the curse finally break, not through a ritual, but through the agonizing, beautiful possibility of a tomorrow he hadn't forced. He would wait. If it took decades, he would be the ghost guarding her happiness, proving that the man who once used her was finally gone. Tae-Hyung, V. Moon learned that you can't buy a soul without losing your own. If this story of power, sacrifice, and the haunting cost of a single choice moved you, make sure to subscribe for more gripping narratives. Like this video to support Sora's journey, share it with fellow drama lovers, and comment below. Is there any sin too great for love to wash away? Don't forget to turn on post notifications so you never miss a chapter. Thanks for watching.